If you have even a passing interest in games, you can't fail to notice that Japan is one of the juggernauts of the industry. A technological and economic boom in the 1980s saw the country exporting its culture like never before, which in the West was variously met with fear, curiosity, and for some, obsession. As fate would have it, in the world of games, Japan's boom just so happened to coincide with a collapse in the American gaming market, which left a Nintendo-sized hole that wouldn't stay empty for long, and kicked off the country's tenure as an industry heavyweight. In the decades since then, if there's one Japan-grown genre that's resonated most with Western audiences, it's the JRPG. And if you grew up playing games at some point after that 80s boom, then it's a safe bet you've experienced a few of them and have built up an understanding of the cliches usually associated with them. JRPG is another one of those labels that I'm not a huge fan of because it's entirely undescriptive and doesn't tell the casual observer anything about a game's design other than the island chain the developers lived on. If you want to see just how useless the term really is, visit any Reddit thread where they're arguing about whether Dark Souls is a JRPG or not. It seems to me that the term is slowly sliding out of favour, especially as other Asian countries continue to grow their own presence in the Western industry, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see where the consensus ends up. Now, with all that said, if you're clued in and you play a lot of games, there are still plenty of tropes that will come to your mind when you see the letter J at the start of that acronym. Turn-based combat, the power of friendship, elemental magic, weird hair, improbable looking weapons, 10 million menus, cutesy mascot characters, killing God for some reason, and last but by no means least, gratuitous fan service that keeps you constantly guessing what demographic it could possibly have been made for. Clichés aside, I hope you'll agree that these features are by no means uniquely Japanese, nor are they present in every game produced by Japan, and in fact, I can easily go back through the list and provide examples of Western games that do the same things. Now I can see your swiping finger getting itchy, and I hear your frustrated cry. Start talking about Persona already! Well, thanks for the segue, because the opening point I'm building towards here is that Persona 5 actually is a uniquely Japanese game, and that's because it was made by a Japanese developer specifically about the real-life country of Japan, its society and its future, and I found this infinitely more compelling than the usual fantasy fare that fills out the genre and doesn't much interest me. This isn't some abstract magical mushroom world where nothing bad ever happens. The setting is modern-day Tokyo, with the exact year deliberately left ambiguous, presumably to help the game stay relevant for longer and avoid dating it. The story goes to some surprisingly dark places, and isn't afraid to shine a light on contemporary social issues in Japan, which I think it deserves a lot of credit for, though it stops short of taking any specific political stance, which is probably a sensible call these days, to be honest. In case it needs saying out loud, I'm not Japanese, so I can only see their society from an outside perspective that will inevitably be skewed somehow by the medium of transmission. But suffice to say that playing Persona got me interested and sent me down a pretty deep rabbit hole of investigating Japanese history and society. And if that isn't a sign of a good JRPG in the truest sense of the term, then I don't know what is. Okay, so that's the J part covered. How about the R, the P, and most importantly, the G? Well, in terms of gameplay, there are two halves to Persona 5. There's the social side that takes place in the streets and classrooms of Tokyo, which sees you forming bonds with your companions and improving your personal traits, and there's the dungeon crawling side that sees you entering people's mind palaces and fighting enemies, defeating bosses, opening chests, all that classic stuff. The turn-based combat you engage in while exploring these dungeons has most of the typical mechanics present and accounted for, but with a few original twists that keep things fresh and mean that it rarely feels repetitive. And there's also a healthy dose of Pokemon thrown in for good measure, in case you're someone with a thing for filling out lists. The two halves of the game interact with and influence each other in a number of interesting ways, like party members gaining new abilities as you grow closer to them, or side missions inside dungeons advancing the stories of certain characters. On the whole, these interactions are a little bit one-sided, and the social choices you make outside are far more impactful on a playthrough than what you do inside a dungeon, but I'll get to all that. There's another absolutely crucial feature in Persona that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's one that's pivotal in tying the other parts of the game together and making them work, and that feature is the calendar, which for my money is the most compelling part of the experience. Almost every meaningful action you can take advances time, forcing you to choose between building your relationships, increasing your stats, acquiring new gear, or heading into a dungeon. As the story progresses, deadlines will appear on that calendar, before which you have to complete main dungeons to avoid a game over, and this constant time pressure at your back is a really captivating way of pushing the player forward. Just like in reality, the most valuable resource in Persona is time, and the game is at its best when you don't have quite enough to do everything you want and are forced to make trade-offs and prioritize. As if to taunt you, the current date and time of day are permanent fixtures on the screen, so you can never forget that you're on the clock and don't have the luxury of goofing off. Sadly, this is a feature that becomes less engrossing as you approach the conclusion of the game, as you start maxing out stats and relationships, and end up with fewer interesting decisions to make as a result. But despite its anticlimactic fizzling out, I think it deserves a lot of praise as a compelling mechanic, and by the end you should hopefully be invested enough in the story to not mind too much. So I think I've probably said enough now for you to get a feel for whether Persona 5 is a game you might like to play for yourself before watching the rest of this video. If you're a hardcore weeb, then you've almost certainly played it already, but there's plenty here for normal people to enjoy as well. For my part, I enjoyed it a lot more than I was expecting to, and I would give it a hearty recommendation with just a couple of caveats. Firstly, I wish this wasn't the case, but you will need to have a medium tolerance for cringy fanservice and anime tropes, which are thankfully quite sparingly sprinkled throughout. It's nowhere near enough to ruin the experience, but there are a handful of moments that will have you looking over your shoulder to make sure nobody can see you watching it. Secondly, you need to be okay with settling in for a slow burn, as Persona 5 clocks in at a little over 100 hours, including a fair amount of downtime where the game pretty much becomes a linear visual novel for several hours at a time. Once you're committed to finishing a playthrough, I think you'll agree that the slow burn ends up being a positive, as it allows you the time to grow accustomed to your daily life and routines in a way that pays off later, as you personally feel the anxiety of having them disrupted. The long runtime also gives the excellent music a chance to really drill deep into your head and keep bouncing around in there while you're getting on with your real daily life, which is a great way of keeping you invested throughout the weeks or months that make up your playthrough. Final piece of admin, it feels relevant to point out that Persona 5 Royal is the first game in the series I've played, and I enjoyed it enough to go back and check out the rest of the series too. I played a few hours of Persona 1, which is very different, and as of the making of this video, I'm midway through Persona 4, which has more or less the same structure as 5, but with an unrelated story and a few gameplay differences. Because I don't want to keep saying the number 5 over and over again, I'm going to refer to the game in this video as just Persona, and while I'm sure a lot of the observations I make can be applied to the preceding 2 games as well, I'll make it explicitly clear anytime I start talking about the series more broadly. Now, enough stalling, let's get into it. There are spoilers ahead, so this is your last chance to play the game blind before watching. As always, we might as well start things off at the beginning and see how the game introduces itself to the player before I start digging into all its different systems. It starts off by placing you firmly on rails, as the game holds your hand through the first week or two while it sets up the story and introduces you to all the mechanics. You're basically playing a visual novel interspersed with combat tutorials for the first 5 hours or so. On paper, that sounds like an agonizingly long time, but it doesn't drag when you're playing it for yourself, which is largely due to the strength of the story. And given the gravity of that story, particularly in the first arc, I think a certain amount of build-up is necessary to help the player get invested and make sure the darker revelations feel earned and don't come across as cheap shocks. In any case, it's only around 5% of a playthrough, and on a reluctant second run I had to do for reasons I'll explain later, I was able to get through this linear intro in about an hour, fast forwarding through all the dialogue, which I suppose goes to show just how much of it is story setup. I'll get into the actual substance of the story in a later section, but for now, all you need to know is that you and your fellow Phantom Thieves can enter palaces in the metaverse using an app on your phones, parallel worlds made manifest by the corrupted desires of people abusing their positions of authority. By breaking into a palace and stealing their most valued treasure, you can change the hearts of these abusive adults, removing the twisted hunger from their psyche and causing them to confess to all their crimes and abuses in the real world. After the story and stakes of your first target have been established, the game finally lets you off the leash to use your time however you choose, as long as you achieve your goal of changing their heart by the deadline you've been given. Once you've done so, and the day of the deadline arrives, the game throws you back on rails again to show you the fallout of your actions, and then to introduce your next target and your next party member, usually one of the target's victims. After a bit of tension has been re-established and a new deadline has been called, the game opens up yet again and gives you the freedom and responsibility to prepare for another palace infiltration before you run out of time. This accordion structure of narrowing to introduce characters, provide exposition, and lay out the conflict, and then widening again to set the player free to resolve it over the next few weeks, persists for the entire runtime of Persona. I was initially a bit annoyed the first time it started restricting me in order to set up the second arc, but I eventually came to appreciate it as a good move that helps a lot with pacing. It prevents you from getting too far ahead of the curve on side activities and stat progression during downtime, while also keeping you eager to get through the visual novel so that you can satisfy the itch you have to return to leveling your stats and improving your relationships. Importantly, in the segments where you're given more freedom, it stays that way until the end of the deadline, so once you get used to the rhythm of that accordion structure, you can usually trust that it will let you do your thing without intruding too much. This isn't a hard and fast rule, however, and it can be a bit frustrating when the game keeps a firm hold on your hand, even when you're inside a palace. Sometimes you're just not allowed to act on your own initiative until you follow the script the game has in mind for you, but thankfully this is a pretty minor complaint and it doesn't come up too often. But anyway, when you're not on rails and you're given the opportunity to act freely, the responsibility of using your time wisely is all on you, and you can get a game over and a bad ending for failing to steal your target's treasure within the time limit, although the constant reminders from both the UI and other characters make that pretty unlikely. Now that the game has opened up and you have a high number of possibilities ahead of you, it's hard to know which direction I should go from here with my analysis, since the different features of the game are all well integrated with each other. But since I've talked such a big talk about the merits of the time limit and the compelling choices it generates for the player, I might as well start there and back that up with a breakdown of just how it works and what those choices look like. Time management is a mechanic that's come up in a couple of previous videos on my channel. I'm thinking of Unsighted and Dead Rising specifically. And while those games have a literal clock counting down as you play, Persona's approach to time management is, funnily enough, a bit more turn-based, or slot-based as the case may be. On any given day, you have 2 time slots to use however you see fit, an afternoon one and an evening one, with different options available for both, and these options usually boil down to either improving your relationships with other characters or increasing your own stats. Improving your standing with your party members grants them new passive abilities in combat and makes fights a lot easier, so prioritizing those relationships is sort of a no-brainer. But other non-party confidants can give you some pretty indispensable capabilities as well, like the shogi player who teaches you how to swap party members out mid-battle, an absolutely essential skill as far as I'm concerned. One of the most useful non-party member relationships you can invest in is the one with your teacher, whose perks all revolve around giving you extra time slots, and given that time is Persona's only irreplaceable resource, this is invaluable. Sometimes progressing these relationships requires completing a side quest in a metaverse dungeon, or having a certain level in one of your personal stats, which will slowly level up over time as you gain points in them, usually from solo activities like reading, watching slop on TV, or working a part-time job. Occasionally, if it's a school day, you'll see a classroom scene and get the opportunity to answer a question or dodge some chalk for a free stat point. You can also sometimes get lucky and find a seat on the morning train, which lets you get some reading in for free. Smash that like button for a relatable commuter moment. Many of these solo activities have optimal times to do them. For instance, studying gives you more points when it's raining outside, and working at the convenience store pays better on certain days of the month. On top of that, not every confidant is available every day, so a certain amount of improvisation and reacting to circumstances is always necessary. Quirks like this give you obstacles to work around that can not only affect your decision making day to day, but also encourage long-term planning as you try to optimize and get as much out of your limited time as possible. And chasing after that efficiency in a system with so many moving parts is a really powerful motivator. And now we come to the point of all this self-improvement. The final type of activity available to you during your free time is making a visit into the metaverse, which you can do on any day of your choosing, either to enter a big randomly generated dungeon for completing side quests, or to enter your target's palace and make your way towards the treasure at the end of it. While entering the metaverse takes up one of your daily slots, you can spend as long as you like inside with no time limit, which has a few adverse consequences that I'll get to in a bit. Since completing a palace is the only thing you absolutely have to do before each deadline, naturally it makes sense to prioritize that above all else and complete it without delaying too much, especially because you'll sometimes encounter an obstacle that needs to be cleared by leaving the metaverse and doing something in the real world, which will end up costing you an extra day. Hopefully this breakdown has given you a feel for the intricate way all of your choices during these free time sections can layer on top of each other, as you level your stats, get money and gear, improve your relationships, and make calls about what's most important to you while preparing for each entry into the metaverse. In case I haven't made it clear enough yet, what makes all of this work is that you know you don't have time to do everything before the deadline arrives, which means that you, the player, have to personally decide what's paramount to you and make certain choices at the expense of others. The time limit is what makes those choices meaningful. If you had an infinite number of days, then all decisions would be meaningless, and of course you would just get every upgrade and max out every relationship before proceeding to the ending. So, now that I've laid out the basics of how the social management side of the game works, it's time to engage in a little criticism. First off, to give some praise where it's due, one feature I quite like is the network button, which lets you see what activities other players were doing on the same day during their playthrough. It relieves some of the pressure you might feel over the time limit by showing you that there isn't a single correct answer, and also underscores that every person's experience will be unique depending on what's important to them, something that I think has been a running theme throughout the series. Another feature whose usefulness cannot be overstated is the fast travel menu that can be opened at any time to instantly teleport you to wherever you want to go. I'm aware that I've criticised fast travel in plenty of open world games before, but I think it's a perfect fit for Persona because on each day of the calendar there are exactly 2 meaningful choices for the player to make, how they're going to spend each of their daily time slots. Once that choice is made, getting there and initiating the activity shouldn't be a chore, and in fact this game makes it about as effortless as it could possibly be, which is a big win in my book. Also worth mentioning is the fact that you can see the locations of all available confidants right there on the map, so you don't have to explore every single location every single day just to check what your options are. This is something that's currently irritating me about Persona 4, so I'm retroactively grateful for its inclusion in 5. Sadly, the game doesn't always show this level of respect for the player's time. When you hang out with your confidants, you can get extra points to level your relationship faster if you're holding a persona of the same tarot card as them, which isn't a bad idea in and of itself. But the reason this mechanic turns into a poorly thought out waste of time is because heading to the Velvet Room and switching to a relevant persona is a free action that costs you nothing. So if you want to be as efficient as possible with your limited number of days, there's a clear incentive to do it every single time you hang out with someone with no downsides. Thanks to this, getting that relationship bonus isn't a meaningful decision. It's just something that requires a tedious, time-consuming, and ultimately boring trip back and forth, and these wasted minutes grate and add up quickly if you're doing it multiple times over consecutive days. The core of the problem here is that when you give the player access to a beneficial action that doesn't advance time, it means they can perform it for free, and depending on just how beneficial it is, they might be incentivized to tediously repeat it over and over again in order to maximize its usefulness. An innocuous example is the plant in your room. Feeding it is a free action and raises your kindness, so it makes sense to check it every day and see if you can get some free stat points. This isn't a huge deal because it's very quick to do and it can become a natural part of your daily routine. A less harmless example, however, is the fortune teller in Shinjuku, who can increase your relationship points with any confidant once per day in a free action that comes with no time loss and a negligible cost in money. Again, if you want to use your limited time efficiently, then there's nothing to lose and everything to gain by visiting her every single day, and doing it over and over again ends up becoming very tedious indeed. In fact, if you're really min-maxing for every shred of progress you can get out of each day, you'll want to make use of another one of the fortune teller's services, which also constitutes a free action, and can even be done back-to-back with the relationship bonus. While the dialogue choices in main story sequences are completely inconsequential, choosing the right responses during hangout sessions with your confidants is an essential way of earning favour with them and progressing your relationship faster. If you pay the fortune teller for it beforehand, you can have the best responses highlighted for you to make sure you don't miss out on any points, another highly beneficial free action with no downside. And now that I'm on the subject, I find something kind of silly about the way these scenes encourage you and reward you for acting like a sociopath who constantly tells people exactly what they want to hear, which I think is a pretty shallow implementation of a dialogue or relationship system. You only gain relationship points during hangouts, not during obligatory story moments, no matter how emotional or bond-forming they may be. You never have to do anything like, say, choosing between two characters in an argument, or choosing between pleasing one character and pissing off another. In fact, the worst that can happen if you pick the wrong response in a conversation is that you miss out on a couple of potential points that you'll have to make up later. But it's impossible to lose points no matter how rude or dismissive you are, or how often you leave your friends on red. You don't grow closer to people by being similar to them or sharing their values or goals, but simply by being in the room with them while they experience their own stories. You also don't impact these side stories in any way. You just drop sycophantic comments on them as they happen around you, and often the blandest and most boring answers are the ones that bag you the most points. I tried making a joke with Sojiro and he got mad and called me a moron. So, okay, fine, maybe he's not ready yet to joke about the depression diet of his traumatized adoptive daughter. That's fair enough, but just look at these other responses. It is a good idea. I guess so. I think so. I'm glad to hear that. That's fascinating. I suppose the main criticism I have of this social simulation is that by gamifying it in such a straightforward and isolated way, it really removes any reason the player might have to take the character's struggles at face value as emotional stories. Every single female confidant will confess their love for you out of nowhere after you hang out with them 10 times. And while this obviously gets points for realism, it's ironic that as soon as you get a confidant's relationship stat to 10, there's zero reason to ever spend time with them again. You can have 7 different women all thinking they're your girlfriend, despite the fact you ghosted all of them a month ago, yet somehow this never comes up or interferes with the team spirit among your harem, party. Individual relationships are completely siloed from the rest of the game, which weakens any sense of narrative significance they might have had, and, to be honest, makes them pretty difficult to take seriously. The game seems to know this and mostly plays it for laughs, but I find this to be a bit of a callous way of treating characters that can otherwise be quite relatable and sympathetic. Of course, I suppose you can turn this back on me and say that I'm the callous one for accepting the affections of multiple confidants, but when the game has zero narrative or emotional consequences for doing so, I think I'm justified in pointing the finger of blame away from myself. Despite all my problems with how you get people to like you in Persona, one thing I do appreciate here is that you only get one chance at each conversation option, so if you misread a character and say the wrong thing, there are at least some mechanical consequences in lieu of any narrative ones, which is somewhat in keeping with the overall theme of time being precious. For the majority of a playthrough, it remains the case that time is the most priceless and irreplaceable resource there is, and as I think I've said enough by now to make the point, time's limited nature is what gives your actions meaning, both in Persona and in reality. Thanks for spending yours watching this video, by the way. As you proceed through each arc of the game, more of Tokyo opens up to you and new characters and activities become available for you to spend your time on, and for the most part the game strikes the right balance of introducing new options before you've had a chance to max out the old ones, which keeps your decisions feeling meaningful and ensures that there's no single correct answer for how you should spend your time. Unfortunately, there's one very, very major exception to this that's made 1,000 times worse because the game doesn't have the courtesy to tell you just how important it is. There's one confidant, the counselor, who you need to reach a relationship level 8 with by a certain deadline about 3/4 into the game, otherwise he disappears from the story. If you fail to do this, which is quite easily done given how many other confidants you have competing for your time, you miss out on a huge 20-hour chunk of the game, an additional palace, a new party member, and an epilogue with a final boss that might be one of the game's most enjoyable. In principle, I don't have an issue with certain content being locked behind choices the player makes, but the problem here is that the game doesn't tell you how important this confidant is. I initially finished the game missing out on that epilogue chapter, and I could tell I'd missed out on something because there were a bunch of narrative threads still hanging that ended up going nowhere. When I checked online and realised that I was one relationship level away from getting access to the proper ending, believe it or not, I was pretty fucking pissed off. And to make matters worse, if you don't have a save you can load from before that deadline, there's nothing you can do. You have to play the entire game again if you want to see all that extra content at the end. Since I already knew I wanted to make a video about Persona, I felt obligated to grit my teeth and do this for the sake of seeing everything the game has to offer, but I wasn't happy about it, and if I didn't have this channel, I might have just given up on it and watched it on YouTube instead. Which to my mind is one of the worst things you can say about an experience that's supposed to be interactive. Mercifully, in my second playthrough, I was able to get back to that endpoint in only 20 hours by speeding through all the dialogue and story moments. Obviously a big improvement on the 100 it took me the first time, but still almost an entire day's worth of my lifespan. While this forced replay really rubbed me the wrong way and had me questioning the developer's respect for my precious time, ironic considering the time-conscious gameplay mechanics, at the very least I can say that I was invested enough in the characters and story to want to see it through to the end and give it the proper send-off despite the annoyance, and overall I'm glad I did. I still think it's unacceptable though, and every player should be warned beforehand of the hidden importance of that one social link, but the game built up enough goodwill in other areas that I'm just about able to let it go. Sadly, that's not the only criticism I have of the time management system as you draw closer to the game's conclusion. The emphasis on using your activity slots wisely starts to break down as you near the end and have started to max out your stats and important relationships. With every completed relationship path, you end up with fewer interesting decisions to make on how to spend your days, and that engrossing time management side of the game becomes far less complex as you reach the end, not more. You know it's bad when a once valuable resource becomes something that's no longer precious to you, but instead something you need to find ways to waste, for instance by going to the gym over and over again to raise your SP by a few points because everything else is already maxed out. With your personal stats at their highest potential, paying attention in classroom scenes or making an effort to answer questions correctly also becomes pointless, and earning money through jobs becomes completely irrelevant when you realize you can infinitely farm it in the metaverse, one of the adverse consequences of letting you spend as much time in there as you like. This slow fizzling out as the end draws near might be the second most disappointing thing about the game for me, but then again I only feel that way because of just how engrossed I was in the time management up to this point. So yeah, what can I say? The critic gives with one hand and takes with the other. Maybe this is something for Atlus to work on for the eventual Persona 6. Thankfully, the dungeon crawling and combat side of the game more than picks up the slack in the finale with a very satisfying culmination of mechanics, so that's the area I'll turn my attention to next. Turn-based combat has been around for a long time, and finding new ways to keep it feeling fresh and original is surely no small feat. The effortlessly stylish presentation of battles is certainly carrying some of that weight in Persona, but in terms of mechanics, the way I see it, there are two possible ways of keeping players engaged while interacting with what is essentially a menu not too different to the ones from 40 years ago. The first is to make the player's choices in that menu impactful in more complex ways than just damaging enemies, when your options are meaningfully distinct from each other and will lead to very different outcomes with no clearly dominant strategy, you're sure to consider them more carefully. The second way of keeping players engaged is to give them some kind of meta consideration to do in between battles. The incentive to make efficient use of limited resources like consumables or skill points encourages long-term planning and gives each decision in combat an importance that it wouldn't have if each battle took place in isolation. Now, I'm not saying Persona invented either of these concepts by any means, but I am saying that it does them both very well. Well enough to be engrossing right to the end of a playthrough. Let's dive in and break down how it all works. To start with the fundamentals of the player's options in combat, there are quite a few metrics that you'll need to be keeping track of, all of which are interconnected and can affect each other in different ways. There are the obvious ones like health and skill points, which persist between battles and deplete when you take damage or use magic respectively, and the also reasonably obvious mechanic of elemental weaknesses. But where things begin to get interesting is in the options that become available to you as you try to best exploit those weaknesses. When one of your party members uses a skill or attack that corresponds to an enemy's weakness, that enemy is put into a downed state, and the party member gets to either have another move immediately for free, or pass their extra move onto another member to increase their damage with a baton pass. And these can even be chained together for a huge damage bonus if you can use all 4 party members in a row. Some enemies will be weak to one element but resistant to another, or will even be healed by certain elements, or reflect the damage back to you, which means that you need to be careful when using skills that target all enemies at once. The elemental affinities of each enemy are hidden the first time you encounter them, and revealed as you experiment with each one. Thankfully, the game is gracious enough to put these on screen so you don't have to memorize them all. With 10 different potential weaknesses, including 8 elemental types as well as physical and gun attacks, there's already a lot to keep track of here, but believe me, I'm just getting started. If you can manage to get all of the enemies in a battle knocked down at the same time, you can go for an all-out attack which essentially just gives you a bunch of free damage that usually ends in a wipeout unless the enemies are particularly strong. Figuring out the most efficient way to do this to each group of enemies is a constantly evolving dynamic puzzle that never gets old. And I can keep going. Some enemies have no elemental weakness, but can still be knocked down if you get lucky with a critical hit, or if you cast a status ailment on them and then hit them with the right technical attack, which is a smart way of turning status attacks into a genuinely useful option rather than a total waste of a move, as it so often is in other comparable games. You'll also occasionally run into special enemy types, like volatile ones that can instantly respond to any attack that doesn't kill it, but will explode upon death and deal heavy damage to its fellow monsters. Or these treasure enemies, which give big rewards on kill or capture, but will run away after a couple of turns, forcing you to choose between focusing on them or the actual threat posed by other enemies. Your party members have their own elemental weaknesses too, by the way, and if an enemy skill hits one of them, then they get to have an instant second move just like you do. The party member will also be knocked down and becomes more vulnerable to attacks. And I haven't even mentioned yet that downed enemies can be negotiated with to give you money or items, or to join you as new summonable personas, which is a whole other Pokemon adjacent thing that I still have to cover, but by now I think you've probably got the point that there's a lot going on here and plenty to keep the player making trade-offs in a state of constant calculation. With all of these interconnected systems in play, Persona is able to keep combat interesting through its entire runtime by throwing enemies at you in different combinations, with different reactions to each element. And on top of all that, there are also resource management considerations to be made during and between battles. When exploring a palace and fighting enemies, almost every move you make costs you a little something. Every choice is meaningful in some way, and you'll be thinking in the long term about your entire palace run, not just each individual battle. Even if you're faced with the same configuration of enemies for 2 encounters in a row, which can occasionally happen, your decision making will never be exactly the same because you'll start the fight with slightly different health and SP values that might incentivize you to act differently. Every choice you make in combat will be influenced by the current state of your party and the long-term and short-term factors you're currently keeping track of, and each decision can ripple out into a wide number of different outcomes that will in turn affect your future decisions, with no clear correct answer to any given combat problem. I think this intricate turn-by-turn branching out from the starting point of a battle or a palace holds the key to what complexity really means in game design, but in the interest of saving a comprehensive discussion of chaos theory for a future day, I'll leave it at that for now. Instead, maybe some practical examples would help to get the point across. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's the boss fights that give the best demonstrations of how complex Persona's combat can get, so I'll stick to them for a minute. For some of them, you need to get quite strategic with your buffs, heals, and other skills to make it through. The one that stood out to me as one of the toughest is the CEO boss in the Factory Palace. It's a sort of puzzle where you only have 2 rounds of combat in which to take out each full team of progressively stronger and tankier enemies. If you don't manage to pull it off, they all run away and get respawned at full health, meaning you have to try again from scratch, but this time you have less health and less SP. If you lose momentum in this fight, then you can easily fall behind and get stuck, then have to patiently wait for the enemies to kill you so that you can try again. With such tight restrictions in place, you really need to think carefully about which combination of moves will lead to enough damage to get you onto the next phase, and this can often mean making use of calculated baton passes and costly support skills, sacrificing a chance to attack now in order to increase potential damage later. Skipping way ahead to the final boss of the epilogue, which fittingly serves as an excellent combination of all the combat mechanics, there are some great twists in play that really turn each move into a decision with multiple rippling effects. Every turn he respawns 3 tentacles that can either heal him, shield him, or cause status ailments to your party. These tentacles have randomized elemental weaknesses and strengths, including repelling certain damage types back to you, which means that dealing with them comes with a constantly shifting set of small decisions and trade-offs. Let's say 2 tentacles are weak to fire, but the 3rd repels it. Should you use a group fire attack, getting a hit on the boss and doing severe damage to the weak tentacles but taking some damage from the third? Or should you just attack a single weak one so that you can avoid damage and guarantee a baton pass to a character better positioned to exploit the current state of play? Or should you sacrifice a move to cast a buff on the rest of the party? These are just some of the questions that you'll need to be constantly reassessing turn by turn, and while it's a lot more pronounced during a boss fight like this one, the same applies to fights with standard enemies as well, especially because you need to keep a closer eye on your SP when making your way through a palace battle by battle. So with the basic framework laid for what I think makes Persona's combat system compelling, we can move on once again to some deeper criticism. There are some features that add to the complexity by layering more interesting choices on top of it, but there are also those that remove complexity by taking choices or trade-offs away. I'll start with the bottom layer and the options available on a per battle basis, then work my way up from there. I really like the addition of guns as an alternative non-magical attack, and the way that ammo works is a great touch that can add a surprising amount of strategy to encounters. It resets at the start of each battle, so you always start a fight with full ammo for each character, and on your turn you can use as much of that maximum as you like, but that obviously means you won't have it for any future turns in that encounter. If you use it all too early, you can end up in a situation where you have no way of performing any gun attacks at all. When you're fighting small fry, this isn't really a big deal, and you can use the high damage of guns to end very simple encounters in a single turn. But when you're up against a boss, or a more foreboding enemy, you need to get a bit more strategic with them and pick your moments to unload carefully if you want the maximum results. Ammo essentially works as a per encounter resource that's separate from any other, which is a great way of adding yet more metrics for the player to keep track of, though since it only affects the short term, I think there's a lot of runway here to increase the complexity even more by looping it into some long-term considerations for the player to make. Say for instance, if gun attacks caused enemies to drop more money or XP, or if ammo could be replenished through the use of an expensive skill, which could lead to some interesting trade-offs to make. And on the subject of expending unconventional resources, another feature that I think is quite clever is that Persona skills dealing physical damage consume health points instead of skill points. The trade-off this leads to is straightforward enough. Do a big chunk of damage to your opponent at the cost of damaging yourself, which means you'll need to devote more attention to healing than you otherwise would, which will probably end up coming out of another character's pool of skill points. While this is a relatively simple idea by itself, it's an option that adds another thread to the complex tapestry of choices available to you, and in a battle where the enemy side is also damaging you and potentially hitting your elemental weaknesses, it's something that may or may not be worth the risk on any given turn. And speaking of risks, there's only one way to see a fail state in battle, and that's if the main character's health reaches 0. Your allies can always be revived from this state, but if it happens to the protagonist, then it's game over. Naturally, this gives you an incentive to prioritize him above all other characters in combat, which is further reinforced by his unique ability to carry multiple personas and switch between them at will, an ability that I think is a bit overpowered and messes with the game's balancing. To give a very brief rundown for those who don't know, a persona is a sort of spectral manifestation of a character's inner psyche, and it also lets them do magic. While most characters have a fixed persona that slowly learns new skills of a single element as they level up, the protagonist can carry more than 10 personas at once, and with 8 skills to a persona, that means you can have upwards of 80 different skills available at once just through the main character. As promised in the game's dialogue, this does indeed make him into a wildcard, but it also makes him ridiculously overpowered, with the ability to respond to practically any situation and no real weaknesses. The scene in the casino palace, where you take on an arena full of enemies single-handedly, is all the proof you need of this. The way that you get new personas is by downing enemies in combat and then negotiating with them instead of performing an all-out attack. Picking the right dialogue options will cause the persona to turn into a mask and join your deck, and by making a visit to the Velvet Room, which is a free action you can perform at pretty much any time, you can fuse your collected personas together to make more powerful ones that inherit their skills and abilities. The huge compendium that slowly fills up across a playthrough will have an obvious appeal to those with a completionist mindset, and there's enough visual variety to personas that it's almost always satisfying to encounter a new one. There's a healthy amount of input from the player in creating new personas, and certainly some strategy involved in specializing and then maximizing the potential of each persona in your deck, but once you've made those choices in the Velvet Room, it doesn't really have much of an impact in combat, since you can switch personas for free once per turn while looking for whichever move you want anyway. I also have to say that constantly switching personas around prevents you from actually getting attached to one and growing with it over time, as all the other characters get to do. It's sort of silly that the one you start with is prominent in so much promo material, yet in the actual game you'll replace him within half an hour and never look back. Now don't get me wrong here, all in all this wildcard problem is a fairly marginal complaint, and it's easy to let it go considering all the other intricacies of combat that I've already praised. But still, I think it's worth pointing out as an interesting case of a feature that surely you would think could only increase the game's complexity, as it adds hundreds of equipable options for the player to consider in between battles. In reality, however, having access to basically any move you could ever want on a single overpowered character actually reduces complexity in the battle layer of the game by removing impactful decisions that you would otherwise have to make. Just a little more restriction here could have made the wildcard ability more balanced. Maybe if switching between personas used up a turn in battle, you would think more carefully about the one you had equipped, kind of like how switching party members costs you a turn. While I'm here, I just have a couple of other minor observations to make about the way the player finds and creates new personas. When you down all the enemies in a battle and use the opportunity to negotiate and recruit a new persona, the other enemies instantly run away and the battle ends with you getting way less XP and money than if you'd slain them all, meaning that you have a clear incentive to kill instead of capture. I think this was a bit of a misstep, particularly in the early game when the player has yet to fully understand the importance of gathering new personas. Thankfully this is turned around a couple of palaces in, once the prison alarm is introduced. This can randomly come into effect after concluding a battle, and it means that your next persona fusion will get a bonus, providing a great reason and a great reminder to keep returning to the Velvet Room to experiment with fusions and see what you end up with. Great mechanic. The final option I want to mention regarding combat is the showtime moves that allow two party members to team up and pull off a high damage move together in a little cutscene that lets them show some personality. It's up to you whether you activate these moves when they're available, but you don't really have any control over when the option presents itself, although it seems to happen more often when a character is getting up from being downed. Still, because it's never guaranteed, you can't properly strategize around them, and I don't think they contribute anything to the tactical depth of combat. On top of that, as charming as they may be, every player has a limit on how many times they're willing to watch the same cutscene, and will eventually start skipping it every time. If these were saved as unique finishers for mini-bosses, they could have been a great addition to the game's visual appeal without outstaying their welcome, but in their current implementation, I think I have to give them a thumbs down. They're a great idea and an entertaining way to let the characters interact, but their flawed and repetitive execution sucks the fun out of them and they end up as style over substance. Despite the nitpicks I'm ending my discussion of combat on, I hope I've made it clear just how compelling I think the different potential interactions within this system can be. With the vast complexities of all its interconnected mechanics, Persona pulls off the incredible feat of making turn-based combat feel new and original, and if that doesn't make you want to give it a try, then nothing will. You've probably noticed the theme by now that long-term consequences are what I consider to be key to making a player's actions meaningful, and so far the layers I've been talking about have been individual battles and the palaces above that. But there's another layer even higher above that in managing your time wisely across the entire game, and this is because entering the metaverse isn't a free action and it costs you a full day. This is a great move and it's what ties both sides of the game together, but I find myself wishing that the devs had taken the concept even further. While it's true that heading into a palace costs you a time slot, once you're inside, there's no limit on how long you can spend there, which means that you're heavily incentivized to make as much progress as possible on each visit, or even to finish the whole thing in one night if you can. This is exactly what I did in pretty much every case, in order to minimize the number of time slots I spent on it, and again, I think it's great that this is possible. My choice to one-shot each palace was a strategic one that I made for myself, and one that influenced my decisions inside the palace as well, as I had to be way more mindful of conserving SP across my runs. It also ingeniously nudged me to do something you will almost never catch me doing in RPGs, and that is using consumable items. If I'm given a choice between leaving a palace early so that I can come back tomorrow with full health and SP, but losing a valuable day in the process, or using consumables to get through it in one sitting, I'm picking the consumables every time because they're less important to me than the time loss. While so many RPGs feature a story about a race against time to save the world or whatever, 99 times out of 100 it's purely a plot contrivance with no effect on gameplay. In Persona, where time actually is limited, it becomes something that's actually precious to you, the player. The hard limit put in place by this time pressure is easily the greatest innovation in the game and the series as a whole, and I really can't overstate just how much it elevates the whole package. And so, perhaps it's no wonder that I wish the devs had pushed even harder on the concept. Since you can spend an infinite amount of time in the metaverse, this creates a bit of a perverse incentive to grind enemies for XP or money in order to get the most out of each visit. This isn't a huge problem in the palaces proper, since they have a definite goal at the end which keeps you moving along a set path with a steady escalation of challenge and variety, and when you reach that goal, you know you're finished with it and it's time to leave. In Mementos, however, the randomly generated side dungeon that you enter to complete side quests, the infinite time limit and lack of any concrete stopping point means that you have a clear incentive to grind and try to maximize the usefulness of each trip. Considering that killing a single treasure enemy can net you 10 times the amount you would get from using a time slot on working a job, this turns money in Persona into a total irrelevance, and any decision involving money becomes a trivial affair. There's no reason not to buy the most powerful weapons and upgrade them fully, and there's no reason not to pay the fortune teller for her various bonuses every single day. Once you have Ryuji's Confidant ability that instantly resolves encounters with enemies weaker than you, you might find yourself spending more than a few minutes going back and forth through the monotonous corridors of Mementos, hoovering up tons of free XP and money by basically doing nothing, with zero decisions to make and no limit besides how bored you might be getting. This can have a bit of a snowball effect, as all the free XP leads to you leveling faster, which means you can do the same thing to stronger enemies for even more XP, and can even start doing it inside palaces, which removes a lot of meaningful resource management decisions the player would otherwise have to make. Despite that complaint, I'm still glad for the inclusion of Ryuji's Confidant ability, because it makes slogging through the random passages of Mementos infinitely more bearable. This randomized dungeon feels like completely unnecessary filler and is pretty much the worst part of the game. It's certainly the bit I dreaded most on my begrudging second playthrough. Going back to play Persona 4, I was unpleasantly surprised to find that every dungeon in the game is a randomly generated maze like Mementos. To give credit where it's due, the hand-built palaces of Persona 5 are a massive improvement over that, and I hope next time the devs go all the way and slice off the last remnant of this randomized design. But anyway, the point I was trying to make a minute ago is that it may not have been the best call to allow the player to spend an infinite amount of time exploring palaces. If there was some kind of limit on how long you could spend in a palace, and you knew it wasn't possible to complete it in one sitting, I think this could lead to a lot more strategic decisions for the player to make. This wouldn't necessarily have to be a time limit, but that would be the most obvious way to implement the idea. Grinding would no longer be a way to get free XP, but would still be an available option for players who wanted to find a time-efficient way to do so. Searching for will seeds, an optional task in palaces that rewards you with a powerful equipable item, would also become something the player actually had to choose to spend their limited time on, instead of something that has no downsides to going for. Even better would be if the limit was a sort of gradient rather than a hard line that immediately kicked you out of a palace. Maybe once you passed the limit, enemies would start becoming stronger, which I imagine would lead to some tense moments as you try to squeeze a last bit of progress out of a day's run before becoming overwhelmed. Limiting the player's time in palaces could also create an opportunity to link together their actions in the outside world as well. If completing palaces happened over a number of visits with breaks in between, there could have been parallel goals for the player to complete in the real world too. The game comes close to doing this in a couple of palaces, but the roadblock always gets resolved through on-rails cutscenes with zero input from the player, which I don't find particularly interesting. Essentially what I'm saying is that I think dungeon crawling in Persona could be improved by carrying over some of the time management mechanics that make the other half of the game so engrossing. To be clear, I already think it's pretty damn good as it is, and it involves a lot of meaningful choices for the player to make, but it could be even better if the devs were willing to lean even further into the game's strengths. To give a quick example of a moment that could be improved by a time limit, in the third palace, the mobsters, you can choose to spend money to open doors and skip certain sections if you so desire, which is a nice idea that fits with the theme of the level, but there's no real trade-off being made here. You can easily make that money back by hanging around to grind enemies, so I don't think this is a truly interesting choice. If you were under time pressure, however, there would be an actual decision to make here, with pros and cons on both sides. You might be tempted to say that the game already places limits on your progress through palaces via SP management, a resource that depletes as you use magic to attack and heal, and that will almost certainly bring you to a halt if you run out of it. There's some truth to this in the first few palaces, and as I mentioned earlier, the first palace even pushed me to replenish my SP with consumables, which would ordinarily be unthinkable for me, and serves as a great proof of concept for the compelling choices that can come from limiting the player in some way. Once you're halfway into the game and the support character Futaba has joined you, however, your SP concerns will gradually start to melt away. Surprisingly, the most overpowered party member after the protagonist is the one that doesn't actually join you in combat. Instead, Futaba will cast occasional random buffs or heals on your party that can't be reliably counted on or planned around, so I'm not really crazy about her effect on combat, even though I like her as a character. You might even occasionally be annoyed by this ability, as it can sometimes give you a party-wide buff for free that you just wasted a move on casting manually. The ability of Futaba's that really breaks the game's balance, however, is the one that restores HP and SP to characters not currently in the party, which means that as long as you keep swapping members around, something you can do from the menu at any time, you'll never have to worry about running out of healing potential and being forced to choose between leaving or topping it up. Getting a free restore after each battle means that you no longer have to think of fights as a string of connected encounters. Instead, you can just approach each one individually. In this way, Futaba's passive restore ability is a feature that reduces the game's complexity by reducing the impact of the player's decisions, as there will no longer be any long-term consequences to which moves you choose to perform on your turns. That overpowered restore ability is one that every player will get access to eventually as Futaba passively levels up via battles, but at least the random buffs she can cast are ones that you need to choose to invest in by spending time ranking up her relationship. Which gives me the perfect segue into a quick word on the interactions between the dungeon crawling and the social sides of the game. These interactions flow almost exclusively in one direction, with confidant relationships influencing you and your allies' abilities inside palaces, but not much going the other way. The one exception to this is the side quest mini-bosses in Mementos, which are sometimes necessary to defeat to progress a confidant's story. But unlike the social sim, there aren't really any interesting choices involved in completing these, and there's no reason not to do so. The closest the side quests come to presenting an interesting decision is in choosing how many of them to let pile up before heading into Mementos to tick them all off in one visit. Each day that passes in the social sim brings new unique decisions, and every relationship you choose to progress comes at the expense of others you could have picked. Inside a palace or Mementos, however, progress is pretty much linear, and there aren't any decisions to be made with permanent consequences, especially with time being unlimited. I'm not sure exactly what form these consequences could take. Maybe healing or reviving an ally in combat could gain you relationship points or something like that. I actually don't love that idea because it could be too exploitable, but my point is, it just would have been nice to see your actions inside the metaverse have some mechanical consequences outside, as they currently only have narrative ones. Again, I think limiting the player's time inside palaces somehow would go a long way towards making their actions more meaningful. To start wrapping up my thoughts on combat and dungeon crawling, I want to address the game's difficulty, or depending on your point of view, the lack of it. Do I personally think Persona 5 is a difficult game? No, but I also think that getting hung up on that term is asking the wrong question, and also sort of missing the point. The game has no less than 5 difficulty options to choose from at the beginning, which will dictate percentage modifiers for damage dealt to and received from enemies, but the difficulty can be changed in the options menu at any point, so the initial choice doesn't really matter. I always question the wisdom of giving the player a choice like this before they've even started playing, because I think it shifts responsibility onto the player that should really be in the designer's hands. Any complaint or criticism I try to make about difficulty can be instantly brushed aside by telling me that it's my fault for picking the wrong option. On top of that, throughout the game you have a lot of dynamic control over difficulty on smaller scales too, since you can always choose for yourself whether you want to fight palace enemies flagged as extra tough or not. They usually have a lot of health, and so force you to deploy some of your precious SP to take them out without losing a ton of health yourself. But they also give more XP and money, so the calculation of risk and reward is yours to make and may look different for every player. For what it's worth, I picked the normal difficulty at the beginning and stuck with it for both playthroughs. The first time because the description implied that it's the intended experience, and the second time because I wanted to rush through the game and didn't feel like making it harder on myself. But anyway, if asking about difficulty is the wrong question, then for Baphomet's sake, what's the right one? Well, at the risk of providing a handy recap to end this section with, I think it's far more revealing to inquire into how the game provides the player with meaningful decisions to make, how it incentivizes the player to act in certain ways, and how far-reaching the consequences of their actions can be. That was quite a mouthful, but I think it can be summed up by invoking my favourite word that I love to throw around in every video: complexity. I think my use of that word has remained more or less consistent across the videos on my channel, but lately I've been thinking about it like this. Complexity is a measure of how much the player's choices impact the future choices that will be available to them later. Resident Evil 4, incredibly complex game. Armored Core 6, not a very complex game. While exploring the palaces in Persona, it was exceedingly rare for me to have any difficulty dealing with an enemy encounter, and I actually beat most of the game's boss fights on my first try as well. Yet despite that lack of immediate challenge, I was almost never bored at any point in a palace because the mechanics are so complex that I always felt like the choices I was making in combat were important. There are two desires that will drive your decisions in battle. You want to take out enemies as efficiently as possible to avoid damage to your own party, but you also want to conserve SP and consumables for later battles if you can help it. The tension between these two incompatible drives is where interesting choices emerge from, and each battle will inevitably see you making trade-offs between them as you constantly re-evaluate what your priorities are on any given turn. It's not at all difficult to check the enemy's weakness at the top of the screen and then choose the right spell from a list, but because it always costs you something to use that spell, it's a meaningful choice whose consequences will remain with you long after you've made it. If you make those choices carelessly, then it's quite possible you'll eventually find yourself in a difficult spot with no SP remaining and a powerful mini-boss in your way. But again, focusing on difficulty is missing the point. The point is that regardless of what's ahead of you in a palace, which is unknown to you on a first playthrough anyway, knowledge of the game's complexity and being aware that choices have long-term consequences is enough of an incentive to take decisions seriously. Playing on hard mode may narrow slightly the range of strategies that are viable, but if the game is sufficiently complex to make the player feel the weight of their decisions, then they will, regardless of the difficulty setting. I suppose what I'm trying to say with all this is that complexity trumps difficulty every time, and if you want to see just how flexible this game can be, you can check out some of the many different challenge runs available on YouTube. A series of turns make up a battle, a series of battles make up a palace, a series of palaces make up a playthrough, with impactful social choices to be made on the spare days that weave between them all. And Persona is at its very best when the decisions you make at each of these scales can ripple up and down the chain and affect the options and decisions available to you later. It doesn't always work exactly like that, and there are a handful of meaningless choices and features that reduce complexity rather than adding to it, but on the whole, I have a huge amount of praise for the mechanics of Persona that makes it easy to recommend to anyone with an interest in, let's call it, long-form game design. But I'm not quite done discussing Persona yet, because it doesn't stand on the strengths of its excellent gameplay alone. It also has a story to tell and a narrative for the player to get invested in, and it's there I'll move on to next. If you've been paying attention to the footage so far, then you've no doubt noticed just how cool and sleek the menus are in Persona, which is fortunate considering that you spend more than half the game using them. Clearly, presentation is a huge part of the Persona experience, and I'm sure it's not a coincidence that modern technology plays such a key role in the story, via group chats with your friends and the app that you use to get into the metaverse. The same is true in Persona 4, which sees you climbing inside a flat-screen TV to go dungeon crawling, so I think it's safe to say that a major theme of the series is how modern tech changes the way we perceive and interact with the world. In case you can't tell from my video thumbnails, I don't know quite enough about graphic design to adequately explain what makes Persona's presentation feel so well polished, but one thing I can praise is the way the player interacts with menus while in combat. The game pulls a subtle but very effective trick by making each menu option correspond to a different button, rather than being something you have to scroll through with a selector. Naturally, this makes it a better fit for playing with a controller, but I think it also helps make it all feel a bit less like an abstract menu, as your choices can be more easily tied to muscle memory rather than having to read and select from a list every time. It's a small touch, but it plays a big role in contributing to the sleek feel of the whole experience. As for the presentation when you're not dungeon crawling, it's pretty much what you would expect from a visual novel, but the sound effects and cutaways add some style to dramatic scenes, and the ability to open a log and see previous dialogue from a conversation is a vastly appreciated feature. What I feel far less complimentary about, and what I really don't like, are the anime cutscenes. There aren't that many of them, so this is a pretty minor irritation, but they don't accomplish anything that couldn't have been done in the game's actual engine, and to be honest, they just look kind of cheap. Dialogue scenes that take place in-engine may not always be visually interesting, but at least they're consistent with the art style of the gameplay and don't rip you out of the world and into a parallel anime dimension. Now I'm anticipating plenty of comments that will look like this, but I have to call it like I see it, and I just don't think these cutscenes are a worthwhile addition to the game. If anything, they only dilute from its usually excellent visual flair. They're also constantly making that annoying anime noise, you know the one I mean.
Huh? Right. That was truly cringeworthy.
A nasty gamer.
Anyway, there are just a couple of other details I want to bring up before getting into the story proper. When a party member first awakens to their persona abilities in a cutscene, their outfit changes and suddenly they have a mask on, which they then have to take off again in order to summon their their persona. This always felt a little clumsy to me, and call me old-fashioned, but I liked it better when the children just had to shoot themselves in the head. For the most part, all the different personas and shadows look pretty cool, and you might even catch yourself learning something about some of the more obscure mythological inspirations, although you can sort of tell when the devs were able to use shortcuts on designing similar personas of the same tarot affinity. Knowing that the manipulation of the collective unconscious is a big theme in Persona, it won't shock you that there's a hell of a lot of sexual imagery in this game. It usually falls on the side of being suggestive rather than explicit, but in case these are all too subtle for you, here's a giant dick on wheels. The creative breaking of taboos in these designs gives the impression that they're about more than simple titillation, and if you'll pardon the expression, I think they do a good job of tugging on subconscious threads to elicit instinctive responses from the player. The last aesthetic element that no discussion of Persona is complete without is the outstanding music. If you're going to make the player listen to the same handful of tracks for hours and hours, you better make damn sure they're good. And they are. Persona's soundtrack is catchy without a doubt, but it's also complex enough to stay feeling fresh after dozens of listens, and to stay stuck in your head when you're living your own daily life. Even if you haven't played the game, I'm willing to bet you've tapped your toe or nodded your head to at least one of the tracks in this video, but believe me when I say that each one is only enhanced when you know the context of where it's supposed to play. Go to the video for any track from the OST and you'll find hundreds of comments from players giving their emotional take on it and what it means to them. There's simply no way I can discuss every great track here, but I'll just zoom in on one in an attempt to show you a slice of what I think makes them so good, the one you're hearing right now, Beneath the Mask, which plays when you're exploring Tokyo by night, looking for confidants to spend time with, buying supplies to see you through your next palace visit, or just enjoying the ambience. I wouldn't usually read so much into a bit of background music, but I spent enough weeks humming it to myself that I think I'm justified in making a few observations. The piece is built around this simple two-note refrain, which evokes the daily routines and repetitions we all fall into, not just in Persona but in our real lives too. The organ takes us for a ride through a melodic verse and chorus, the unique interactions that make every day just a little different from the last, but it's always guided by, and finds its way back to, those two simple notes: night and day, work and home, on and on. And just when you think you've got this track figured out, the first time you go out at night after defeating your first target in the metaverse, around a month or so into the story, you're enjoying the music as usual, and then, bam, it has lyrics now. I love that the game waits until you're deep into it, and presumably on the hook to finish the whole thing, before pulling the trigger on this. I admire the restraint, and it makes the reveal way more effective, as you've already started getting a feel for the game's themes before it starts literally singing them at you. That said, just like in Metal Gear Solid, the lyrics are mostly nonsense that were obviously written by somebody without English as a first language, and their delivery makes it impossible to know for sure what they are until you cave and look them up later. Love it or hate it, you can't deny that the fuzzy understanding you have of the song, even after multiple listens, does lead you to pay a lot more attention to the music, and that uncanniness carries a large part of the familiar yet different charm. That goes for the music of Persona, and also possibly goes some way to explaining the Western fascination with Japanese culture more generally. Now, with all that talk about Persona's presentation out of the way, over an hour into a video about a very story-heavy game, I'm finally going to get into what the story actually looks like. I've saved it for last because this is a game after all, and it's the interactive elements that I came for. But with Persona being half visual novel and half RPG, both genres well renowned for their lengthy narratives, perhaps as much as 75% of a first playthrough will be spent reading dialogue boxes and pressing A. That's not a complaint, and there are enough meaningful daily choices for the player to make in between those text boxes that I rarely found myself getting restless. In fact, a good portion of those text boxes come as a direct result of the daily choices you make, as you decide who to spend time with and whose side stories to advance. I can't deny, however, that experiencing this game, story and all, is a substantial time commitment, longer than most of the so-called prestige TV shows that are also competing for you to fritter your limited free time on. Thankfully though, if like me you find yourself incessantly drawn to the interactive medium above all others, you can rest assured that Persona's story does a pretty good job of justifying its length. Let's start at the beginning. Falsely convicted of assault by a powerful politician, our teenage protagonist is placed on probation and sent to live with a family friend in Tokyo for a year, with the aim of keeping his head down and settling into an unassuming school life. As the player, you have control over his name and dialogue choices throughout most conversations, and while there are pretty much never any narrative consequences for these choices, I think the intention is just to add a bit of flavour and make it easier for the player to self-insert, a goal which it mostly achieves. Fortunately for the Zoomer attention span, only a single day passes before you get into trouble and find yourself transported to a twisted nether version of the school, ruled over by the shadow of the perverted and tyrannical PE teacher Kamoshida, his sadistic desires leaking out as a parallel world, his palace, where he sees himself as an untouchable monarch. You and your new friends are quickly pulled into conflict with the Kamoshida in the real world, and things get very dark, very fast, when the full extent of his abuse becomes clear and one of his female victims jumps off the school's rooftop. For the most part, this is all handled with the maturity and severity that it deserves, and I was surprised and more than a little bit impressed to see the game going there so early into its runtime. The scale of the story may start very small, but the stakes are real enough to draw you in right from the beginning. The fact that this character has his own Wikipedia page should tell you something about the splash made by this tragically believable storyline. Irritated by your group's accusations and accustomed to total impunity from management that would rather look the other way, Kamoshida warns you that he plans to get you all expelled at the next teachers' meeting in a few weeks' time, which gives you your first calendar deadline and finally lets you off rails to use your time however you please, making all those interesting decisions I've already been over. When you do make the call to infiltrate Kamoshida's goon palace and retrieve his treasure, it has the intended effect of changing his heart, leading to his tearful confession in front of a stunned audience of students and faculty. I'll spare you the play-by-play of every single thing that happens after this first arc is over. Suffice to say that a new villain becomes known to your team, you find out just how evil they are, recruit one of their victims as a new party member, and beat a boss battle against their palace's shadow to change their heart and force a public confession out of them. Rinse and repeat this pattern 7 times, as the stakes get higher and also somehow more personal each time, with your 7th target turning out to be the very same politician who falsely accused you way back at the beginning. After each turn of this cycle, the sudden changes of character in your targets don't go unnoticed by the powers that be, and it's actually more plausible that something supernatural is afoot than that abusers enjoying their power trip would willfully give it up. So as the story proceeds and the Phantom Thieves become more and more well known, the walls start closing in, accounting for the rising tension across each arc. It's not hard to see the thematic through line here, as your party continues to encounter people abusing their positions of power and exploiting those beneath them. And I also think this is where we can reach a deeper understanding by injecting a bit of context about Japanese culture, in particular about hierarchy in Japan. one thing that even the most casual observer of Japanese media will notice is the titles or honorifics that are used when one person addresses another, an ever-present linguistic feature that offers a constant reminder of the social hierarchy and each person's place in it. Japanese is far from the only language or culture that does this, and I'm sure there are subcultures that deliberately flaunt their breaking of these rules. But my aim here is just to point out how ubiquitous this awareness of hierarchy is in Japan, a sort of social sixth sense that a Western onlooker, myself included, can never fully comprehend or experience. The ideal behind this Confucian social contract is that respect is supposed to flow both ways, up and down the hierarchy, as youngsters follow orders and pay homage to those above them, while those in authority offer their wise stewardship and promise to use their privilege in an enlightened way. I'm not claiming to be an expert in Japanese culture, even though I have seen at least 2 Studio Ghibli films, but I feel reasonably comfortable standing by what I've said so far. And so, to come to the point, in a society that places a high value on paying deference to your elders and people in positions of authority, what do you do when some of them start unfairly taking advantage of that power? When instead of responsibly guiding the next generation to be ready when they pass the torch, they hold it tight to their chest and refuse to let go? After all, it's only what they're owed by those ungrateful youths, isn't it? To call them out on their bullshit would be breaking the taboo of respect, and nobody wants to be the troublemaker who does that, so they get away with pushing boundaries until they can pretty much do whatever they want with no repercussions. If you try to speak out against an injustice that everyone can see happening right in front of them, you get a broken leg for your trouble, as happened to Ryuji before the events of the game. Yusuke, the struggling artist and eventual party member, at first actually defends his patron, or sensei, from the Phantom Thieves, despite knowing that he's being exploited and his work is being plagiarized. The fear of breaking that contract of respect runs deep enough that victims will avoid doing so, even at great personal cost. In Persona, the only way to address the unfairness that everyone can see and is willing to ignore is through supernatural means, at least to begin with. The fact that your goal in each arc is to change your target's heart, rather than, say, to kill them, which it might have been in a Western game, suggests to me that Persona's story is about restoring that balance and order, rather than overturning it, a prospect that may be a little too radical for a relatively conservative culture. The game has the grace to let you ponder all of this without beating you over the head with its own answers, and the question of whether or not the vigilante justice you're dishing out is ethical is constantly murmuring in the background. The Phantom Thieves have flipped the table and now find that they are the ones with the power to make others act against their will. They may not be abusing that power right now, but the temptation is always there, the very same temptation that corrupted each of your targets throughout the story. A catchy and ambiguous character who serves as a sort of dark counterpart to your party plays their foil as he uses his own metaverse access for more selfish ends than the protagonists, proving just how thin the line can be between just and unjust uses of power. And all of this isn't just some airy hypothetical either. It's no secret by now that modern Japan's demographics have the old vastly outnumbering the young. And while this is a fate that seems to be coming for all industrialized nations, I'm sure it hits a little different in the ones where custom demands that elders are given greater respect. Themes of rebellion against authority aren't exactly alien to Western stories, and I'm sure Persona can be enjoyed and understood without any of this context. But I think that examining it through the appropriate cultural lens can be a more enlightening exercise, and this is why I find the game's story a lot more interesting and relevant than the usual escapist fantasy fare. The purpose of storytelling, after all, is to use fiction to explore some essence of truth about our real world, and Persona accomplishes that in a uniquely Japanese way to make a meaningful and thought-provoking commentary about the modern reality of their nation. As outsiders looking in on a piece of media created by a foreign culture, about that same foreign culture, we can't help but observe it with our minds just a little bit more open than we might view something produced closer to home, clouded with the invisible biases and assumptions that all people take for granted. If you're a Baka Gaijin like me, then the moment you realize that Japanese students have a 6-day week and go to school on Saturdays may have been a bit of a culture shock. An unspoken assumption came crashing down, and I was left more receptive to the familiar yet different than I would have been otherwise. Even with my limited knowledge of the series, something I found myself musing about while playing Persona was why the games are always set in a school with teenage protagonists, when they could just as easily be about salarymen in an office building. That actually sounds like a pretty cool idea to me, and the CEO's sweatshop palace is a good proof of concept for the idea. I suppose part of it is probably about appealing to teenagers as a large segment of the potential audience, and the sexual imagery the game is steeped in lends weight to that, But I wonder if it's also partly because almost everyone in Japanese society carries that shared experience of their school days in their collective unconscious, with all the highs, lows, excitement, boredom and trauma that comes from it all. The self-insert nature of the protagonist seems to support the idea that he's a stand-in for the average Japanese citizen, although the fact that he's canonically male, and definitely not gay, does suggest a certain amount of fixed characterization, and if you want to read into it, probably says something about what that society considers to be normal or average. I might be stepping a little too far out of my lane with the last 5 minutes of comments, but playing Persona really did get me thinking more deeply about Japanese culture, and sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole on their history and society. I hope I haven't said anything too inaccurate, and more importantly I hope I haven't come across as a weeb, which I'm definitely not, but instead as someone with a broad interest in the varied cultures, societies and politics of the world. To dish out some scattered praise as a palate cleanser before moving on, each target's palace has its own narrative that you explore while making your way through it, and sometimes this narrative even plays out mechanically, most noticeably in the boss fights. The mobster attacks you by dropping money on you until he runs out, and the instant he does, he's immediately deserted by his lackeys. The CEO boss quite literally commands his workers to sacrifice their lives for the company, and they slavishly detonate themselves for massive damage. It might not blow your mind, but I still think it's pretty clever, and a neat way of weaving a metaphor out of mechanics, something you don't see too often that's worth a shout out and a thumbs up. In Futaba's palace, the only one that belongs to a victim and not an abuser, you piece together her fractured and discarded memories to shine a light and bring her out of her endless depression, and even if it's a little on the nose, it's still quite touching and relatable. On the slightly less praiseworthy side are the personal side stories of each confidant, which generally see them getting over some personal issues or roadblocks while you stand nearby and cheer them on. I don't think the player can really be said to be taking part in these stories, but at the very least you choose which ones to progress at the expense of others, so there is a certain amount of personal involvement. Previously I said how good I think this is as a meaningful mechanical choice, and that's still true, but as a collection of stories, I think they leave plenty to be desired. For mechanical reasons, each confidant's story needs to be exactly 10 chapters long, which leads to a lot of those chapters feeling like filler, or like one conversation stretched over multiple hangouts. Combine that with the fact that several in-game months and dozens of playtime hours may have passed between 2 chapters, depending on your priorities, and it can be a little hard to really invest in them and take them seriously. And this is before mentioning that every female will fall in love with you out of nowhere, maxed out confidants are never worth spending time with again, and the status of your relationship with each of them will never impact the main story, even when it really should. Speaking of which, we need to get back to that story, because of course it can't end until you've killed God at least once. After unmasking the politician's true nature, the public ignores his confession and continues supporting him anyway, so you make one last dive into the far depths of Mementos, a manifestation of the will of the regular residents of Tokyo, the palace of the public. For all my very valid gameplay complaints about the repetitive nature of Mementos, I do at least think it makes a good metaphor for the collective unconscious. If you think of a city as a superorganism made up of millions of individual humans, then the metro is its circulatory system, and the slow descent of mementos from subway tunnels into pulsing veins is a cool visual trick. At the very bottom, you encounter the Holy Grail, the symbolic heart of apathy and acquiescence, to which the people of Tokyo have willingly given up their agency in return for comfortable lives free of difficult choices. Oh yeah, and it's also God, by the way, so you need to kill it to restore the concept of personal responsibility to humanity. Linking this back to the themes from the rest of the game, I guess giving in to this God of control is like submitting to the ultimate authority for the sake of an easy life. It's easier to shut your eyes and uncritically perpetuate the situation that's been passed on to you, rather than do the hard work of examining why it looks that way and why it keeps on failing. There's a bit of setup to this on the way down that helps to get this point across, as you can speak to members of the public who have voluntarily caged themselves, but to be honest, I'm really not a fan of the reveal all too common to RPGs that there was some divine power behind the plot all along, and I have a few reasons for that. 1. It removes the importance of human agency in the story and makes it all into a good versus evil thing that I don't think is capable of saying anything truly interesting about our real mortal world that's far more complicated than that. 2. It's a huge anticlimax to such a long story, almost like a Deus Ex Machina in reverse. And 3. It utterly robs the story of any metaphorical power by making explicit and literal the unconscious forces that are much more powerful when left unsaid. Just imagine if you were reading To Kill a Mockingbird and at the end, Atticus Finch saved the day by shooting the god of racism in the head. Yeah, pretty stupid, isn't it? This is a large part of why I feel like the vanilla story just sort of fizzles out into nothing rather than actually going anywhere. The protagonists kill God, and then it's just a nice happy ending for everyone. It all feels a bit toothless and bland, and I found it to be an unfulfilling send-off for the characters I'd spent so much time with. Thankfully, there's a far more satisfying end to the story if you know ahead of time that you need to prioritise the confidant path of the counsellor, Maruki, or I guess if you just really like spending time with him for some reason. Through his own research into the metaverse and its power to manifest desires as parallel worlds, he engages in the ultimate act of wish fulfillment and reshapes the world into one where everyone can have exactly what their heart truly wants. On the surface, that obviously sounds great, but that's the whole point. What you want isn't always what you need, and in practice Maruki's world is a hollow facade where your desires are manufactured for you at the cost of giving up control to a benevolent dictator. I love the way this whole sequence is introduced to the player, as you personally get the sense that something is off when characters start talking about seeing family members who you know for a fact are dead. It's horribly bittersweet to spend a few weeks living in that idyllic but tragically false world, meeting each party member in turn and seeing what could have been if only it wasn't for the unfair bullshit they had to endure as people looked down on by society. As usual, the music makes for a perfect accompaniment to the atmosphere, a twisted and melancholy rearrangement of one of the main daily themes. Futaba and Haru's scenes here were the ones that tugged my heartstrings most. Futaba having her trauma erased and getting another chance to live a normal life with her resurrected mother, and Haru imagining a world in which her CEO father actually gave a shit about her as a human being and not just as a bargaining chip. Adding more bittersweet fuel to the tragic bonfire is the fact that you, the player, have to intrude on their fantasies one by one and wake them all up from this false reality. I guess the takeaway is that you can sit around telling yourself comforting lies for as long as you like, but sooner or later you need to wake up and face the real world. Seeing each character go through this carries a lot more emotional weight and feels way more personal than anything present in the vanilla ending, and I'm glad I went through with a second playthrough in order to see it. With all the gang back together for one last rodeo, you can enter Maruki's palace, take on a fitting final boss, and say goodbye to the metaverse and the world of Persona 5 for good. And so there you have it, 120 hours of reading, battling, and occasionally cringing, and the credits have finally begun to roll. I've neglected to give a step-by-step of every single story beat because I think getting straight to the big picture makes for a better video. But don't get the wrong idea. When you're actually playing the game for yourself, it's easy to get caught up in each arc and keep that narrative momentum going all the way from start to finish, and you're usually well rewarded for paying attention to what's going on. Who's the next target gonna be? What will the next palace look like? What new mechanic might be introduced to combat next? All these questions and more will be constantly leading you forward, and for the most part the answers are meaningful and have enough depth for you to chew on while exploring them. The only part of the game that I think really constitutes filler is the time spent in mementos, which thankfully can be minimised if you get Ryuji's auto-resolve ability and make sure to pile up as many side quests as possible before heading inside. If you're able to overlook the stumble with mementos, which is easily done since it's only 5 or 6% of a playthrough, then you'll find Persona 5 to be an immensely compelling experience, with infectious music, complex gameplay, and genuine mechanical consequences to your choices, the likes of which are rarely seen in the big budget games of today. I've certainly had my criticisms of it, and there's plenty of room for improvement, but make no mistake, I loved the time I spent with this game. If you've watched this whole video despite not having played it yourself, then I still think it's worth you giving it a try. I've left enough of the story unspoiled that there will be more than enough surprises waiting for you, and as always when it comes to gameplay systems, there really is no substitute for interacting with them yourself, and I highly recommend doing so. With all that said, it's time to bring this video to a close. When I first booted up Persona 5 knowing next to nothing about the series, my only expectation was that it would be a good way to procrastinate and continue to avoid starting Baldur's Gate 3. I really wasn't anticipating that it would resonate with me as much as it did, and yet here I am gushing at the end of a 90-minute video about how great it is. The fact that I finished the game and then picked up Persona 4 a few days later should tell you enough about how much I enjoyed the experience. The detail that makes Persona work on so many levels is the passage of time. That goes for the gameplay, where the calendar forces you to constantly re-evaluate what to prioritize with your limited time slots, and for the story too, where you personally feel yourself settle into a routine, watch the seasons change as you revisit the same streets, and witness the slow burn of your actions influencing the world around you. In the gameplay, the restrictions placed on you by your limited time are what make your actions meaningful. When you have a deadline coming up and there aren't enough days to do everything you want to do, your choices actually make a difference, and they cost you something because they come at the expense of doing something else. This focus on time management is far more noticeable on the day-to-day macro side of things, as you decide which relationships and stats are worth investing your time slots into. But sadly, the importance of your decisions wanes over time as you start maxing them out, and end up with nothing to spend your time on in the final weeks. When the most precious resource in the game is no longer worth anything to you, something has gone badly wrong, and I see this as a major area to work on for the next installment. Moving on to the dungeon crawling, while entering the metaverse does use up a time slot, once you're inside you're pretty much free to grab every collectible, open every chest, and take on every enemy at your own pace, with no real trade-offs to make and no reason not to complete every palace in a single day. In short, your actions inside the metaverse don't cost you any of that global time resource in the same way that your actions outside do, and they end up feeling less meaningful as a result. The fact that a patient player can endlessly grind to level 99 in a single session in Mementos if they so desire is all you need to know to see how this breaks the game. With some more restrictions on how much could be accomplished in one metaverse visit, the game could have provoked a lot more interesting decisions for the player to make. I say a lot more because thankfully there are plenty of other interesting decisions already present in dungeon crawling, mostly revolving around managing other limited resources, mainly SP and occasionally consumable items. This is another feature whose complexity wanes throughout the game, as Futaba's support abilities eventually restore your SP for free and make managing it efficiently far less important. Again, this goes to show that it's the restrictions that generate trade-offs and meaningful choices for the player, but I think I've made that point adequately by now. When you're taking part in individual battles, there are so many different states that enemies could be in, and so many options for influencing those states through your choices that it's rare two battles will ever look exactly alike. Even a seemingly obvious strategy like downing every enemy and using an all-out attack will always require a different combination of moves and a different upfront cost in SP to get everything into position. And this is before factoring in that each battle is really part of a sequence of battles as you explore a palace, so if you're playing smart then you'll be trying to conserve SP or items by finding creative solutions to problems. The ludicrous amount of personas and options you can have access to on the player character is a bit much however, and having such an OP team member permanently in your party can remove the need for clever plays or tough calls that you might have had to make otherwise. Nerfing the main character a bit, placing more limits on the player in dungeons, and adding some social consequences to your actions in the metaverse all could have gone a long way towards making your decisions more globally meaningful while dungeon crawling. As it is now, your choices will only ever affect the current day's run, so there's a lot of room for this to grow to match the impactful choices made on the outside. As for the story, it's hardly my place to step in and tell a Japanese developer how they should be representing their own nation in the media they produce. But what I can say is that the narrative in Persona 5 feels modern, relevant, and relatable, and I think that almost anyone with a sufficient attention span could find themselves getting swept up in it. As a story that attempts to say so much about so many different areas of Japanese culture, it does end up being quite long, but aside from Mementos and one or two fanservice-y trips to the beach, I can't really point to any section in particular that the game would be better off without, and each arc brings a fitting escalation of stakes and pressure that feels like it's going somewhere worthwhile. And it does, as long as you make sure to meet the criteria to see the true ending and avoid the underwhelming vanilla one. As someone with very little patience for the bloated, time-wasting slop that so many big-budget games have become, Persona 5 was such a pleasant surprise, and it really truly felt like a breath of fresh air. It's not quite groundbreaking and boundary-pushing on the level of something like Outer Wilds, but it is a classic concept done very, very well, with truly innovative mechanical twists that I think a lot of games could learn a thing or two from, especially in the open world space. In particular, I'd love to see the next installment double down even further on the limitations and pressure introduced by time management, although now that my experience with Persona 5 has turned me into a series fan, I'll likely be checking out the next one regardless. I often complain about modern games being too long for their own good, and Persona is very long, but in a market full of experiences that take 100 hours to complete, I'd much rather play one with an extended story that kept up the pace for the whole runtime than the usual open world shitfest with the same 4 enemy encounters copied and pasted over an empty and overstretched map. Despite its length, for the vast majority of a playthrough, the game is able to keep up a steady stream of new problems to solve, new story beats to unravel, and impactful daily choices to make, so that it almost never feels like you're repeating yourself or wading through filler content to get to the real stuff. Thanks to this, Persona 5 is quite appropriately a game that actually respects the player's time, and if you enjoy it as much as I did, that precious time will fly by all too fast.